If I was sitting on Lindsay Clancy's jury right now, I would still have way too much reasonable doubt to convict. Because on day 10, Kevin Reddington ferociously cross-examined Dr. Jennifer Tufts, Lindsay Clancy's psychiatrist, in which he went down appointment by appointment, medication by medication, symptom by symptom, all to ask the same question. At which point should any of this have raised a bigger alarm? And I agree. So let's get into it. Let's start with a quick recap from Friday. Dr. Jennifer Tufts was Lindsay's outpatient psychiatrist beginning in September of 2022, and the Commonwealth walked us through months of treatment for significant anxiety, depression, and persistent problems with sleep. Lindsay was knowledgeable about her symptoms and medications. She was able to advocate for herself, and the goal of treatment was essentially to reduce those symptoms and get Lindsay functioning and feeling like herself again. But something important remained consistent throughout Tufts' testimony. She did not observe Lindsay experiencing psychosis. Lindsay repeatedly denied current suicidal or homicidal intent, and although Tufts considered other diagnoses along the way, including bipolar disorder, she did not believe Lindsay met the criteria. Even on January 23rd, the day before the children died, Lindsay appeared depressed and anxious, but appropriately dressed. Her speech was appropriate, and Tufts testified that Lindsay gave her no reason to believe she needed to be involuntarily hospitalized. On Friday, I understood Dr. Tufts' perspective, although I definitely had questions. And I had a feeling that once we got to cross-examination, a lot of those questions were going to be challenged, and oh boy, were they. Reddington started by challenging how much Tufts actually knew about the patient sitting on the other side of the screen. Every appointment she had with Lindsay was through telehealth. She never saw Lindsay in person during the months she treated her. Tufts testified that she considered Lindsay honest and forthright, but Reddington asked whether psychiatric patients sometimes minimize their symptoms. She agreed that they can. And that's important, because Reddington spent much of this cross reconstructing Lindsay's condition, using Tufts' own medical records, particularly the symptoms Lindsay was reporting while Tufts was making decisions about her treatment. One of the first medications he targeted was Zoloft. Tufts prescribed Lindsay 25 milligrams of Zoloft in September, with instructions to eventually increase the dosage to 50 milligrams. Reddington asked whether she discussed potential side effects, including suicidal ideation. Tufts explained that the increased risk she was referring to applied specifically to younger patients. Reddington immediately pushed back. Is there a black box warning on Zoloft? Yes. He then essentially asked, if that risk can exist in someone who's 23 or 24, are you saying it's impossible for someone who's 27 or 28? Tufts responded that the research doesn't demonstrate that. Then Reddington moved to sleep, because Lindsay already had significant problems sleeping when she first came to Tufts. He questioned why she would prescribe a medication that can itself affect sleep to someone already struggling with insomnia. Tufts explained that side effects vary from patient to patient and that Zoloft is widely considered an effective first-line treatment. But then Lindsay actually starts taking it, and according to Tufts' own notes, she feels awful. Her insomnia worsens, her depression increases, her appetite decreases, her anxiety becomes really bad, and she's experiencing racing thoughts. She doesn't want to be alone and is reportedly, quote, paranoid about developing suicidal thoughts. So Reddington asks, was this a patient in trouble? And Tufts answers, I was concerned, yes. This is where Cross changes the picture for me. Had I just relied on direct examination or the Commonwealth's version of events, I would have had an overzealous patient that was getting impatient about how the medication was working on her. But really, this timeline shows something different. Lindsay keeps coming back because she's getting worse. The medication changes, appointments, worsening problems with sleep, brain fog, intrusive thoughts, panic and hopelessness. At one point, Lindsay reportedly says, I feel like I'm going to die. Tufts recommends partial hospitalization and continues treating her. But Reddington also establishes something Tufts didn't know at the time. Lindsay had called a suicide hotline twice. When he asks her whether that surprised her, she says yes. He also questions why she hadn't obtained Lindsay's records from the South Shore Clinic. Tufts' position was essentially that Lindsay had provided her with the information she needed, and Reddington was not having any attempt to soften what these records actually said. When Tufts tried to contextualize a symptom or explain why something hadn't concerned her to the degree he was suggesting, he repeatedly brought her back to the language in her own notes. That exchange, for me, if I was a juror, would have raised so many questions. At what point does she start questioning how much she can rely exclusively on a psychiatric patient's perception of her own condition? Because Tufts herself acknowledged that psychiatric patients can minimize their symptoms. So when you have a patient who keeps coming back because she's not getting better, I'm wondering whether she would want more collateral information, right? What is her husband seeing? What are her parents seeing? How is she functioning when she's not sitting in front of the camera for a psychiatric appointment? I'm not saying Tufts was medically required to do that. I'm asking as a juror evaluating this evidence now, whether Lindsay's self-report was giving her doctors the entire picture and why the doctors weren't asking themselves the same thing. And as Reddington moves into December, the language in those records gets increasingly difficult to ignore. By December 1st, Lindsay reported that Remeron had made her depression and intrusive thoughts worse. Prozac had worsened her insomnia. She couldn't sleep, she was panicking, she felt numb and hopeless, and she reportedly said she felt like she was going to die. She also told Tufts she was close to feeling suicidal. Tufts considered her depression moderate and moving toward severe and discussed partial hospitalization. Then we get to December 16th. Lindsay was reportedly having a, quote, really rough time. She was very depressed, had no motivation, and this time she acknowledged suicidal ideation. Reddington pressed Tufts directly on that. Was she having suicidal ideation? Eventually, the answer was yes. Tufts explained that she asked the critical follow-up questions. Did Lindsay intend to hurt herself? No. Did she have a plan? No. Based on that assessment, Tufts believed Lindsay was clearly struggling, but she did not believe she met the criteria for hospitalization. But there's another piece of that appointment that caught my attention because now we finally get information from someone other than Lindsay. Patrick was apparently present for at least part of that visit and told Tufts that Lindsay wasn't doing well, attributing some of what he was seeing to the Seroquel. Reddington suggested Patrick told her something along the lines of, "You people are turning her into a zombie," and Tufts said that was possible. So now we're getting at least some outside confirmation that Lindsay wasn't simply perceiving herself as unwell. Then Lindsay voluntarily admits herself to McLean Hospital, where she's discharged with a diagnosis of major depression, and she goes right back to Tufts. By January 16th, Lindsay reports feeling worse than ever. She describes low mood and numbness, says she's forcing herself out of bed, and although she's taking care of the baby, she describes bonding as forced. She's also sleeping lightly, sometimes in stretches of only 2 hours. Tufts agreed she wasn't well. Eventually, Tufts prescribes amitriptyline, an older antidepressant, which brings us to January 23rd, the day before the children died. Lindsay's mood and affect were depressed. She reported her heart racing and said she had felt numb for 17 straight days, and she's still seeking help. Tufts decided to titrate the amitriptyline. That basically means that she's gradually adjusting the dose of a medication up or down rather than making one abrupt change. Reddington asks, "You increased her meds, didn't you?" The answer was yes, and he ends his initial cross-examination by putting the defense theory directly to Dr. Tufts. That pushed her over the edge? Tufts answers, "I don't think so." But as it turns out, they were nowhere near done. After the lunch recess, Tufts' testimonies went through multiple rounds of redirect and recross, with both sides repeatedly returning to how she assessed Lindsay and how much information she actually had when she made those assessments. One issue was collateral information. Tufts had explained that Lindsay was intelligent, knowledgeable about medicine, and capable of advocating for herself, which was part of why she relied so heavily on Lindsay's own reporting rather than regularly reaching out to Patrick or Lindsay's parents. Privacy and HIPAA concerns also came up as part of that discussion, and Reddington challenged those explanations. Then another detail became important. Lindsay apparently never told Tufts about her marijuana use. For me, the significance isn't simply that Lindsay used marijuana. It goes back to the bigger question Reddington had been raising all day. How complete was the picture Tufts was getting from Lindsay? Because we already know Tufts didn't know about the 2 suicide hotline calls, and she acknowledged that psychiatric patients can sometimes minimize symptoms. So now we have another example of information about Lindsay that Tufts apparently did not have. But one of the most heated exchanges of the entire day came down to something even more fundamental. What did Tufts' own medical notes actually say? Reddington confronted her with a notation that he interpreted as documenting, quote, pressured speech, which can be associated with mania. Tufts strongly disagreed with his interpretation. At one point she said, "I don't care what it says, I know what I mean." And Reddington was not having it. He came right back. "When you wrote this, you did not say not pressured speech. You said in the medical record, pressured speech." Tufts insisted. She did not have pressured speech. Reddington asked, "Did you write that, doctor?" Tufts acknowledged that she had, but told him, "You're misinterpreting my note." She continued to maintain that his interpretation was incorrect, and Reddington ended that exchange with, "As opposed to yours, I have nothing further." The prosecutor then came back again and showed Tufts another portion of her paperwork where she had checked appropriate under speech, giving Tufts an opportunity to clarify that she did not believe Lindsay was exhibiting pressured speech. And that finally concluded Dr. Tufts' testimony. I do quickly want to mention Dr. Tufts' demeanor because by the end of this testimony, she looked utterly exhausted. I've seen some people interpret her responses as defensive, and there were definitely moments where the exchanges became tense. But if I'm being fair to her, I kind of understand. She had just spent hours being intensely questioned about decisions she made while treating a patient whose 3 children would later be killed. And there's another piece of context the jury now knows. Dr. Tufts is being sued for medical malpractice and wrongful death by Lindsay and Patrick Clancy. Reddington even questioned her about whether the outcome of this criminal case could affect the civil litigation, and Tufts said she didn't know. So, yes, I am evaluating her testimony critically, but I'm also keeping in mind that she is a human being, and she has to answer for clinical decisions she made in real time, years before anyone knew how catastrophically this story would end. The Commonwealth did call one more witness before court ended for the day, Julie Paul, a psychiatric nurse practitioner with South Shore's perinatal behavioral health program. Paul began treating Lindsay in November of 2022, and during direct examination, we heard that Lindsay scored high for generalized anxiety, but screened negative for suicidality, and once again, one of the biggest issues Lindsay reported was sleep. In Lindsay's own words, "I could not sleep." But I'm going to leave Paul's testimony there for today because her examination isn't finished. Court recessed before the defense had an opportunity to cross-examine her, so Reddington gets his turn tomorrow. I'll break down her full testimony in my Day 11 recap once we've heard both sides. After everything I heard today and the way Attorney Reddington was able to challenge a lot of Dr. Tufts' own medical notes, I'm viewing her medical history way differently than I was on Friday. Dr. Tufts never observed psychosis, and that does matter, but Reddington also exposed just how much of her assessment depended on what Lindsay herself was reporting, while showing that Tufts did not have every piece of information about what Lindsay was experiencing. And when I zoom out, what I see is someone who kept seeking help, kept trying medications, and kept deteriorating and still wasn't getting better. That doesn't definitively tell me what Lindsay's mental state was when she killed her children, but if I'm sitting on this jury, the Commonwealth still has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt both the elements of the crimes charged and Lindsay's criminal responsibility at the time. And right now, my reasonable doubt is through the roof. Hell, at this point, I might be the reason we end up with a hung jury. So I guess we should be glad that I'm not actually a part of the jury, right? That was heavy testimony. I really want to know your thoughts. I'll be reading them in the comments. And I also included a little poll. I want to know what your thoughts are there. As always, please like, share, follow, subscribe, do all the things so I can continue to bring you these updates. And I'll catch you tomorrow for Day 11's recap.